It is 8 o'clock in the evening in the year 1849, and somewhere near the middle of the Pacific Ocean, a wooden ship called the Alcyon leans gently into a swell that has been rolling, patient and unhurried, since long before anyone standing on her deck was born. There is no coast anywhere near her. There will not be a coast near her for weeks yet. The nearest land exists only as a line on a chart, folded away in the captain's cabin, a fact someone must keep track of, though nobody aboard expects to see it for a long while. Around the ship, in every direction, the water goes on until it simply stops being water and becomes sky instead, and the line where that happens is turning the color of a dying ember. If you are lying down already, that is exactly right. Let your shoulders sink into whatever is holding you up tonight. A mattress, a pillow, the arm of a chair. Let your legs go heavy. Somewhere behind your eyes, imagine the small motion of a ship finding its balance on water, that gentle forward lean and settle that sailors called simply the roll, and that within a week or two stopped feeling like movement at all, and started feeling like breathing. Tonight we are going aboard that ship. We are not going to chase anything. We are not going to hunt anything. Nobody on the Alcyon tonight is thinking about danger, and neither should you. What we are going to do, together, slowly, is spend an evening the way one young sailor named Nathaniel Cobb actually spent hundreds of them. Calm nights in the middle of an ocean so large it stopped registering as an ocean and started feeling like the entire world. Before the ship existed for us as a story, it existed for men like Nathaniel as a house. It had rooms below where wool blankets and pipe smoke made the air warm despite the sea outside. It had a kind of furniture made of rope and canvas that swayed instead of standing still. It had officers who kept time by little brass bells rung every half hour, all night, so that the ship itself seemed to breathe in a slow measured count that never stopped. We will walk its deck while the light goes out of the sky. We will climb down its ladder into the smell of tar and oak and cedar. We will stand at midnight beside a compass lit by a single lamp and watch the black water light up faintly blue behind the rudder, as if the sea itself were dreaming. And near the end of the night, we will climb into a hammock slung between two beams, the way Nathaniel did, and let the ship do what it has always done for men trying to sleep upon it, which is rock them, patiently, toward rest. Get comfortable now, friend. There is nowhere else you need to be, and no one on this ship is in a hurry either. Tonight we are following one ordinary calm night, from evening into the deep hours past midnight, aboard a 19th century American whaling ship somewhere in the far reaches of the Pacific. Not a chase night. Not a night from the version of this story most retellings prefer, the one with harpoons flying and men shouting from open boats and a monstrous whale thrashing the sea into foam. That version exists too, somewhere in the record of this ship's 3.5-year voyage, but it belongs to perhaps a dozen days out of more than 1,000. There is a comfortable version of this story and an honest version, and they are not the same thing. The comfortable version, built mostly from a single very famous novel and 100 years of paintings and films borrowing from it, tells you that a whaling ship was a stage for violence, that men who sailed on them lived in a state of constant danger and dread. The honest version, the one written in the actual logbooks and journals these men kept day after day, tells you something quieter and, I think, more remarkable. Most nights, nothing happened at all. Most nights were exactly what tonight will be. A calm sea. A slow watch, men mending sailcloth by lamplight and talking about nothing in particular. A young sailor carving a small design into a piece of bone because his hands wanted something to do while his mind wandered home. By the time we finish tonight, I suspect the image in your head of a whaling ship will have changed. Less blood and thunder, more oak and lantern light, and the hush of a vessel moving quietly through water that has not seen a storm in 3 weeks. Before we go any further into that ship, I want to ask you something small. If evenings like this one suit you, if you find more comfort in a place you can walk through slowly than in a list of facts to memorize, would you take a moment to subscribe to this channel? It costs you nothing, and it tells me, in the only language a channel like this understands, that these evenings are worth continuing to make. And if you are willing, tell me in the comments where you happen to be tonight, and what the hour is where you are. I read every one of them, usually early in the morning, with my coffee, before anyone else is awake. Wherever this finds you, friend, I am glad it found you. Now, let us go back to that evening. It is 1849. The date, if anyone aboard the Alcyon were asked, and few would think to ask, would be the 14th of July, though out here dates matter less than bells and watches. The sun is low. The ship is 311 days out of New Bedford, Massachusetts, with perhaps 400 more ahead of her before she turns for home. And a young man named Nathaniel Cobb is standing near the rail, watching the water turn the color of struck copper, waiting for his watch to begin. New Bedford, Massachusetts, in the year 1849, is not a large city, but for its size it might be the richest one in America. Its wharves stretch for the better part of a mile along the Acushnet River, crowded gunwale to gunwale, with ships whose holds carry something almost nobody outside this town thinks about very often. Oil rendered from the bodies of whales, burning in lamps in parlors from Boston to London to towns whose names the sailors who caught it will never learn. The streets smell of tar, of drying cod, of the sweetish rot that clings to a cooperage where thousands of oak barrels are built each year to hold that oil. Counting houses line the main street, brick and granite, their windows lit late into the evening by men totaling the value of cargoes still a year or more from arriving. A loaf of bread costs perhaps 6 cents here. A room in a boarding house near the waterfront runs $1 or $2 a week, more if a landlady includes meals, and sailors between voyages spend it fast, because there is little else out here on the edge of the ocean that a sailor's money is especially good for. But New Bedford is not where our evening happens. New Bedford is where the story starts, and where, eventually, if all goes well, it will end. Tonight, the town and its counting houses and its brick warehouses full of oil sit roughly 6,000 miles behind a ship most of its own owners could not point to on a map with any real confidence. The Alcyon is a whaling ship of just over 300 tons, 104 feet from the tip of her bowsprit to the taffrail at her stern, built 9 years earlier in a yard on the Acushnet River from oak that had been standing as trees when George Washington was a young man. Her hull is sheathed below the waterline in copper, hammered on in thin sheets to keep the worm from eating through her planking during years at sea in warm water. Above the waterline she is black, with a single stripe of white paint running her length, broken by painted squares meant to make a defenseless merchant vessel look, from a distance, like something with teeth. 3 masts rise from her deck, square rigged on the fore and main, carrying enough canvas that on a good day of wind she can make 8 or 9 knots, though tonight, with the breeze barely enough to fill a topsail, she is making perhaps 2. Her name was chosen by her original owners, back when she was launched, from an old story about a woman turned by grieving gods into a bird that could calm the sea itself simply by nesting upon it. Days of flat water and gentle weather that sailors of a much older world called, after her, the halcyon days. It is a slightly grand name for a working vessel that spends most of her life covered in tar and rendered oil, and more than one green hand has laughed at it privately during rougher weather. But on an evening like this one, with the water glass smooth and the sky settling into its long, calm dusk, the name fits her better than it has any right to. She smells the way a big wooden object always smells when men have lived inside it for the better part of a year. Pine tar, used to protect the standing rigging, top note over everything, sharp and a little sweet. Under that, the salt smell of rope that has been wet and dried 1,000 times. Under that, whale oil itself worked so deeply into the wood of the deck and the try-works amidships that no amount of holystoning will ever entirely scrub it out. A smell some men learn to hate and others, oddly, learn to love, because after enough months it simply means home. Cedar from the small chests men keep beneath their bunks, salt spray drying on canvas, and threaded through all of it, faint but constant, the smoke of a dozen pipes. Because nearly every man aboard smokes something in the evening, and tobacco is one of the few pleasures the ship's owners are willing to sell on credit against a man's future earnings. Sound carries differently on a ship than it does on land, and it never really stops. There is the constant work of the rigging, a low symphony of creaks and groans as hemp rope stretches and eases with every roll. The specific voice of thousands of individual strands of fiber taking a slightly different tension moment to moment. There is the water itself, a continuous hiss along the hull, rising and falling with the ship's speed, closer to a held breath than to any sound with a beginning or an end. There is the occasional slap of a loose block against a mast, quickly silenced by whichever sailor is nearest, because on a ship, sounds like that get noticed and get fixed, an old habit built from the knowledge that a loose block at 2 in the morning is the difference between sleep and no sleep for 30 men. And underneath everything, at the half hour, every half hour, all through the night, a small brass bell rings out its count, 1 strike, then 2, building toward 8 before starting again. The ship's way of making sure that no one, no matter how far from land, ever entirely loses track of time. The social world of this ship is small and total. 32 men live aboard her, and for the better part of 4 years, this is the only society any of them will know. There is no evening they can walk away from it, no argument they can end by going home to somewhere else, because the ship is the only somewhere else there is. Officers live aft, in small private cabins off a shared saloon, eating meals a rung above what the crew receives, sleeping on real, if narrow, beds, the men before the mast. The ordinary seamen and green hands who make up most of any whaling crew live forward, in the forecastle, a low dark space in the bow of the ship where the hull narrows to a point and headroom shrinks until even a man of middling height stoops to cross it. Walk further into New Bedford itself, on a market morning, and the town reveals more of its character than its wharves alone can show. Union Street climbs a gentle hill away from the water, lined with the homes of successful merchants, tall, square, unornamented in the plain Quaker style that shaped so much of the town's early character. Brick facades broken by white-trimmed windows, front doors painted a deep, respectable green or black. Quakers built much of this town's early wealth and much of its early conscience alongside it, and the same families who financed whaling voyages by the dozen often sat, on first-day mornings, in a meeting house where a black sailor's testimony carried the same formal weight as a shipowner's, an unusual arrangement for this era that shaped, in ways subtle and not so subtle, the somewhat more open hiring practices that would eventually place men like Amos Weeks and the ship's free black sailors aboard vessels like the Alcyon. Lower down, toward the water, the streets grow rougher, boarding houses and grog shops and outfitting stores crowding close together, their windows displaying oilskins and sea boots and the tin pans and jackknives that make up half of any Green Hands kit, alongside handbills nailed to every second post advertising berths available on this ship or that one, painting each voyage in considerably rosier language than the lay system's actual arithmetic would support. Down at the water itself, 5 whaleboats hang from davits along the Alcyone's rails, slender, double-ended craft perhaps 28 feet long, built light enough for 6 men to row swiftly and sturdy enough to survive being towed by a startled whale for miles when a chase demands it. Tonight they hang quiet and empty, lashed securely against the roll, each one holding, coiled and ready beneath its thwarts, several hundred fathoms of hemp whale line, a set of harpoons and lances kept sharp by the ship's blacksmith, and a small keg of fresh water and hardtack in case a boat should ever become separated from the ship longer than expected. It is easy, looking at them now, empty and still under the darkening sky, to forget how much sudden, urgent purpose they are built for, and how completely that purpose has sat unused for 19 quiet days. Whatever is happening on shore, 6,000 miles away, matters to this ship mostly in the abstract. A gallon of good sperm oil sells this year for a little over $1 in the auction rooms of New Bedford, and a laden whale ship might carry home 2,500 barrels of it, each barrel holding 31.5 gallons. A sum of money large enough to make fortunes for the men who own shares in the ship, and comfortable enough to make careful men of the officers who command it. For the 16 men in the forecastle, that same fortune arrives filtered through a system of payment so unusual that a person hearing it explained for the first time often assumes they have misunderstood. We will return to that system later, because it deserves its own unhurried explanation. For now, it is enough to know that the oil in the ship's hold, however valuable, has very little to do with why any sailor aboard her can be found, at this hour, standing near the rail with an unlit pipe in one hand, waiting for 8 bells. We will meet the man who lives there in a moment. First, one more thing about tonight specifically. The Alcyon has raised no whale in 19 days. Her decks this evening hold no fresh blubber, no smoke from the try-works, none of the frantic, all-hands, days without proper sleep chaos that a successful chase brings. Tonight is what most nights on a whaling voyage actually were. Quiet, uneventful, a ship simply moving across water, waiting. His name is Nathaniel Cobb, and on this July evening in 1849, he is 22 years old, an ordinary seaman, rated able enough that the mates trust him aloft in weather that would still frighten a green hand, though not yet skilled or lucky enough to have been offered a boat steerer's position and the far larger share of the voyage's profit that comes with it. He grew up in Fairhaven, just across the river from New Bedford's wharves, the second son of a cooper who spent his whole working life building the very barrels that would one day carry home the oil from voyages like this one. Nathaniel can build a barrel himself, competently if not beautifully, a skill that has more than once saved him from the worst of the ship's dirtiest work. Because a man who can be trusted with a cooper's tools is worth more to a captain than one who cannot. This is his second voyage. His first, 3 years ago, lasted 31 months and made him, by his own quiet reckoning, into a considerably different person than the 18-year-old who first climbed this same ship's rigging with his knees shaking. He came home from that voyage with enough money, after the owners and the slop chest and the outfitting agent had all taken their portions, to buy his mother a good winter coat and put the remainder toward an engagement ring. Which brings us to the detail that matters most about Nathaniel tonight, more than his rating or his family or his skill with a cooper's adze. Waiting for him in Fairhaven is a young woman named Susanna Handy, 20 years old, the daughter of a sailmaker, and Nathaniel intends to marry her within a month of stepping back onto that same wharf he left from, whenever that turns out to be. He carries her letters, 7 of them so far, wrapped in a scrap of oiled canvas and kept in the bottom of his sea chest beneath a spare shirt where salt air is least likely to reach the paper. He has read each of them perhaps 40 times. He knows, from her most recent letter, delivered by a homeward-bound whaler the Alcyon gammed with off the Galapagos 5 months back, that her father's sail-making business is doing well, that her younger brother has taken up an apprenticeship with a blacksmith, and that she has started, in her spare hours, teaching herself to read music on a borrowed pianoforte, a detail Nathaniel finds so unexpectedly delightful that he has mentioned it, unprompted, to at least 3 of his shipmates. Susanna Handy grew up 2 streets over from the Cobb family home, close enough that Nathaniel can remember her as a solemn, sharp-eyed girl of perhaps 8, trailing her father to his sail loft on Saturday mornings to watch him cut canvas with a curved knife she was strictly forbidden to touch. Her mother died when Susanna was 12, and she has kept her father's household since, a role that has made her, by 20, considerably more capable and considerably more sure of her own mind than most young women Nathaniel has otherwise known. She does not, as some of the other Fair Haven girls do, treat Nathaniel's absence as a romantic tragedy to be endured with a handkerchief pressed to her eyes. In her letters, she is more likely to describe, in precise and faintly amused detail, the argument she had with a fabric supplier over the price of No. 4 duck canvas, or the exact way her brother burned his hand at the blacksmith's forge and refused, out of pride, to admit how much it hurt. It is this quality in her, more than any other, that Nathaniel finds himself thinking about on quiet watches, a kind of steady, undramatic competence that makes him trust, without needing to be told so directly, that whatever is happening in Fair Haven while he is gone, she is managing it capably. His own household, back home, is modest. His father's cooperage supporting a family of 5 in a small but respectable house near the water. Nothing like the grand homes on Union Street, but comfortable enough, warm in winter. Well kept, a house Nathaniel pictures often and precisely, down to the specific creak of its second stair, when sleep does not come easily. Here is the habit that makes Nathaniel Nathaniel rather than simply another ordinary seaman aboard a whaling ship. In whatever spare hour the day grants him, he works at a small piece of scrimshaw, a design worked into a sperm whale's tooth with the point of a sail needle and rubbed afterward with lamp black to bring out the lines. It is meant for Susanna. It shows, in a style considerably more careful than skilled, a ship under full sail beneath a bank of clouds he has been trying, for 4 months now, to render convincingly, and beneath the ship. In letters he practiced first on a scrap of paper before he trusted his hand on the tooth itself, her name. He is not finished. He suspects, privately, that he will not finish until the voyage is nearly over, because finishing it will mean admitting there is nothing left to do with his evenings but wait, and waiting, he has found, is easier when a person's hands are occupied. The Alcyon's crew numbers 32. A mixture of backgrounds that would surprise anyone who has only encountered whaling through paintings of stern New England captains. There are 11 men from Massachusetts and Rhode Island, most of them, like Nathaniel, from families with generations of maritime work behind them. There are 6 Portuguese sailors, most from the Azores, picked up when the ship called at Fayal early in the voyage to take on fresh water and vegetables. Men whose English improves daily and whose card games have become, to the surprise of the Yankee sailors, the forecastle's main evening entertainment. There are 4 Cape Verdean sailors, 2 free black sailors from New Bedford itself, a city where a black man could find work at sea on terms considerably fairer than almost anywhere on land. And there are 3 Wampanoag men from Martha's Vineyard and Gay Head, one of whom, a boat steerer named Amos Weeks, is widely regarded as the finest hand with a harpoon on the entire ship. A skill drawn from a tradition of native whalemen going back generations before any Yankee ship ever left New Bedford's wharves. They do not live as equals. The ship's hierarchy is real and rigidly kept. Captain above mates, above boat steerers, above ordinary seamen, above the green hands, who occupy the very bottom of the ladder. But within the forecastle itself, among the men who share its cramped dark space every night, something closer to real familiarity has grown across 311 days at sea than most of these men would ever have found among strangers on land. Nathaniel has learned 4 words of Portuguese from a sailor named Jacinto. He has learned, from Amos Weeks, how to read a swell for the whale that might be riding beneath it, a skill he has had almost no chance to practice tonight, given how empty of whales this stretch of ocean has proven for nearly 3 weeks. Every man aboard keeps, whether he can write well or barely at all, some version of the ship's rhythm in his head. The watch bill, posted near the scuttlebutt and revised at the start of each voyage, divides the crew into 2 watches, larboard and starboard, each man assigned to one, each watch taking a turn on deck in 4-hour blocks around the clock, with 2 shorter 2-hour dog watches worked into the late afternoon so that the same men are not stuck with the same miserable middle-of-the-night hours. Every single day of the voyage, Nathaniel stands in the larboard watch. Tonight, his watch takes the deck at 8, when the sun has finally gone, and will hold it until midnight, when the starboard watch relieves them, and Nathaniel, if all goes well, will climb down into his hammock and sleep until 4 in the morning, when it will be his turn again. Nathaniel holds a few opinions he mostly keeps to himself. He thinks the captain, a sober and God-fearing man named Aaron Pierce, is somewhat too quick with restrictions on the crew's tobacco ration when discipline slips. A policy Nathaniel privately considers more suited to punishing children than grown sailors, though he has never once said so aloud where an officer might hear it. He also carries, tucked in with Susanna's letters, a slim, much-handled copy of a sea novel, a gift from his father before this voyage began, which he rereads slowly, a chapter at a stretch, rationing it the way a careful man rations anything he suspects he will miss badly once it runs out. Like most sailors who can write at all, Nathaniel keeps his own private log. A slim book bought in New Bedford for a few cents, separate from the ship's official record the captain keeps in his cabin. His entries are short: weather, position, when he can get it from the mate, whether whales were seen, and, most nights, one line about nothing especially important, a joke Jacinto told, the taste of that day's duff, the specific color the sky turned at sunset. Small things he suspects Susanna will want to hear about more than she will ever want to hear about latitude and longitude. Nothing about today was scheduled to feel remarkable, and in most of the ways that count, it has not. That is precisely the point. Let us step back roughly 16 hours to the hour before dawn when today began the way every day aboard the Alcyon 1 begins, in near total darkness, with the small, practiced business of one watch waking another. 4 bells sound in the black hour before sunrise, muffled and made stranger by sleep, ringing twice for each of the 2 strikes that mark 2 o'clock in the morning watch. In the forecastle, the current watch below stirs in hammocks slung so close together that a man rolling over sometimes brushes the shoulder of the sailor beside him. A boy of perhaps 16, the ship's youngest hand, makes his way between the hammocks with a low lantern, touching each sleeping man on the shoulder in turn, murmuring the traditional call that has woken sailors on ships like this one for as long as anyone can remember. 8 bells, and the middle watch is done, and here, unwillingly, is 4 o'clock. Nathaniel is not among the men waking now. His watch, the larboard watch, held the deck from midnight until 4, which means he is only now climbing down from it, cold-fingered, ready for 4 hours of sleep before the business of the day proper begins in earnest around 8. But we are not here for Nathaniel's hammock yet. We are here for the deck he has just left, where the starboard watch, roused from sleep only minutes ago, is arranging itself under a sky just beginning, at its eastern edge, to turn from black to the deep, bruised blue that comes an hour before any actual light. The first job of the morning watch, every morning, without exception, rain or shine, whale or no whale, is holystoning the deck. 2 sailors drag out a supply of soft, fist-sized blocks of sandstone along with buckets of seawater and a scattering of coarse sand, and the whole watch drops to its knees along the length of the deck, scrubbing in slow, rhythmic strokes, working the sandstone against wet planking until the wood, over the course of an hour, turns pale and clean. Stripped of the previous day's tar smudges and tobacco spit and the general grime that 32 men and a great deal of whale oil inevitably leave behind. It is unglamorous, repetitive work, men on their knees at 4 in the morning polishing a floor the sea itself will dirty again within a day. It is also, oddly, one of the more companionable jobs on the ship because nobody needs to think very hard while doing it, and low conversation drifts easily across the width of the deck in the pre-dawn dark. Men trading half-awake gossip and the kind of unimportant jokes that would not survive daylight scrutiny. By the time the sun actually clears the horizon, somewhere close to 5:30 at this latitude in July, the deck gleams pale gold in the new light, and the smell of wet, scrubbed wood briefly overpowers even the tar and the whale oil, a clean, mineral scent that every sailor aboard associates, whether he could say why or not, with the feeling of a new day at sea having properly begun. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely, if you have only ever imagined whaling ships as grim, oil-soaked, permanently filthy vessels. For an hour every single morning, weather allowing, the Alcyon is the cleanest surface most of her crew will touch all day. Breakfast follows at 6, called not by any bell, but by the appearance of the ship's cook, a heavy-set man named Obadiah Freeman, at the galley door with a kettle in each hand. The men take their meal in shifts, the watch just relieved eating first, crowding onto the deck near the try-works or ducking below to the forecastle table depending on weather. This morning, with the sea calm and the air pleasant, most eat topside, seated on whatever surface presents itself, a coiled line, an overturned bucket, the deck itself. Breakfast is coffee, thick, bitter, and sweetened with molasses because sugar ran out 2 months back, alongside a piece of hardtack, a flour and water biscuit baked hard enough to survive a 4-year voyage without spoiling, which every sailor aboard has learnt to soften first by dunking it in the coffee, both because the biscuit is otherwise nearly impossible to bite through, and because dunking gives a man a moment to check, by candlelight or morning sun, whether weevils have gotten into this piece. Most mornings they have. Most sailors have stopped minding, or at least stopped mentioning it. Amos Weeks, the boat steerer, eats near the rail this morning, and it is Jacinto, the Azorian sailor who taught Nathaniel his 4 words of Portuguese, who sits nearest him now, the two of them talking in the low, unhurried tone of men who have shared close quarters long enough to have run out of anything urgent to say to each other and settled instead into the comfortable, undemanding talk of old friends. Jacinto asks, as he does most mornings, whether Amos thinks today will bring a whale. Amos, as he does most mornings, says he cannot tell, and that anyone who claims he can is either lying or lucky. A small ritual exchange the two of them seem to enjoy precisely because neither expects a different answer. The morning watch, its deck now scrubbed and its men fed, turns to the day's real work, which today, with no whale in sight and none expected, means maintenance. Sail trimming as the light breeze shifts a point or two, splicing worn sections of running rigging, a slow, exacting handwork that the older sailors do almost without looking, fingers finding the strands of hemp rope and weaving them back into a single smooth line with the practiced ease that took most of them years to earn. A boatswain's mate goes aloft to check the topgallant yard, moving along a foot rope no wider than a man's hand, 100 feet above a deck that from up there looks disconcertingly small. And, running underneath every other task, all morning, every morning, there is the lookout. 2 men at a time climb to the crosstrees, small wooden platforms fixed high on the fore and main masts, and stand there for a 2-hour turn, scanning the horizon in slow, continuous sweeps for the telltale sign every whaleman learns to recognize before almost anything else, the low, distant column of a whale's spout against the sky. This morning, as for the past 19 mornings, the lookouts see nothing but water, an unbroken circle of it in every direction, empty all the way to a horizon that seems, from that height, to curve very slightly, proof, if any sailor needed it, of how very large and very round the world actually is. Here is where most people get this part of whaling wrong. The popular image holds a lookout in a state of constant tension, eyes straining, nerves taut, waiting for the shout that sends the whole ship into chaos. The reality, most mornings, is closer to a kind of working meditation. A man stands at the crosstrees for 2 hours with almost nothing to look at but water and sky, and his mind, if he lets it, wanders freely while his eyes keep their slow, practiced sweep almost on their own. Men have composed songs up there. Men have solved arguments they were having with themselves for weeks. One sailor on an earlier voyage was famous, according to forecastle legend, for having proposed marriage to a girl back home entirely in his head, working out the exact words while on lookout. Though whether he ever delivered them as planned, nobody aboard the Alcyon can say for certain. By 8 o'clock, with the sun well up and the morning's chores mostly finished, the ship settles into the loose, unhurried rhythm that fills most of a whaling day when no whale is in sight. It is this rhythm, more than any single dramatic event, that defined the actual texture of a sailor's life on a voyage like this one, and it is this rhythm that we will follow, slowly, for the rest of the day and night ahead. At 8 o'clock precisely, it is Nathaniel's own watch that comes up to relieve the morning watch and take the deck through what sailors call the forenoon, the 4 hours between 8 and noon. He climbs the ladder rubbing sleep from his eyes, having managed perhaps 3.5 hours of it, standard for a man on a watch system that never lets any sailor sleep through an entire night uninterrupted for the whole length of a voyage. It is a fact of whaling life that took him the better part of his first voyage to stop resenting and start simply accepting. The way a person accepts weather. The forenoon brings him first to the rigging, where a mate has him and 2 other hands reserving a section of the mainstay, wrapping fresh marline tightly around a spot in the heavy rope where chafe has begun to wear the outer strands thin. It is careful, repetitive work, done by hand, one wrap after another, and Nathaniel has grown, across 2 voyages, into someone who does not mind it, because it asks just enough attention to keep his mind from drifting anywhere unpleasant, without asking so much that he cannot also half listen to the conversation happening around him. That conversation, this forenoon, concerns the ship's stores, specifically the fact that the flour is beginning to run low and will need replenishing at whatever port the captain next chooses to call at, likely somewhere along the coast of Chile or Peru, or possibly the Galapagos again, where fresh tortoises can be taken aboard live and kept for months as a floating supply of meat that requires no salting at all, a practice every sailor aboard finds simultaneously practical and mildly unsettling. Nathaniel contributes little to this conversation. He is thinking, as he often does during quiet stretches of work, about Susanna's letter, about the pianoforte she is teaching herself to play, about whether 400 more days really is an accurate guess, or whether the captain, as captains sometimes do, is simply saying what keeps a crew from losing heart. Near 10, there is a brief flurry of genuine interest when a school of dolphins appears off the port bow, riding the ship's modest bow wave with the loose, showy ease of creatures who seem, more than any other animal a sailor encounters at sea, to be having deliberate fun. 6 men drift to the rail to watch, Nathaniel among them, and for perhaps 10 minutes the forenoon's routine work pauses entirely while 30 tons of wood and canvas and 32 working men give their full attention to animals leaping for no discernible reason except, it seems, that leaping feels good. It is a small thing. It is also, on a ship where excitement is rationed as carefully as sugar, exactly the sort of small thing a man remembers for years afterward. The way Nathaniel will still describe those dolphins, decades later, to grandchildren who have never seen the Pacific. By 11, the dolphin's gone, the watch returns to its rigging work, and the morning tips, almost without anyone noticing the transition, toward noon. Elsewhere on deck this same forenoon, the ship's carpenter, a quiet, methodical man named Elias Dunham, works through his own private inspection of the 5 whaleboats, running a careful hand along each hull for any hairline crack the last hard pull might have opened, checking the fit of oars in their locks. replacing a worn thole pin in the third boat with a fresh one shaped that same morning from a scrap of oak. It is work nobody orders him to do daily and nobody thanks him for doing. But it is exactly the kind of unglamorous vigilance that keeps a boat trustworthy on the one day in 20 when trustworthiness actually matters. And Dunham, who has sailed on 4 previous voyages without ever once seeing a boat fail him at the wrong moment, credits this habit, quietly and without much pride, for every one of those safe returns. The ship's boy, a freckled 12-year-old named Charlie Ames, making his first voyage as the captain's servant rather than a working hand, spends this same stretch of morning polishing the brass fittings on the binnacle and the cabin's small collection of navigational instruments, a task that keeps his hands busy and, more importantly to the men who assigned it, keeps him out from underfoot during the ship's more demanding work. Charlie is young enough that the entire crew has adopted him. In the loose, informal way a group of grown men will adopt the youngest person in any enclosed community, correcting his manners, teaching him knots between chores, occasionally slipping him an extra piece of hardtack when Cook Freeman is not looking. Nathaniel, passing him at the rail this forenoon, pauses long enough to check the boy's splice on a short length of practice line, nods once at the improvement since last week, and moves on, a small exchange that means, to a homesick 12-year-old, 300 days from his own mother's kitchen, rather more than Nathaniel probably realizes. There is a version of this morning that could be told in a single sentence. A ship sailed on. Nothing happened, but nothing happened is doing a great deal of quiet work in that sentence, covering 4 hours of careful rope work, a scrubbed deck, a shared joke about weevils, dolphins at play, and one young man thinking, in the unhurried way a long voyage allows, about a woman 200 days sailing away. This is the part of a whaling voyage that rarely gets told, because it does not lend itself to drama. It only lends itself, patiently, to a life. A green hands lay, on a voyage like the Alcyon's, might run as small as 1/200th of the ship's total profit. A captain's lay, by contrast, typically falls somewhere between 1/12th and 1/20th. Between those two numbers sits an entire economic system, unlike anything most working people today would recognize. That governed exactly how much money every single man aboard this ship stood to make from 3.5 years of his life. Whaling voyages were not paid for in wages, not in the way a factory hand or a farm laborer of this era understood the word. Instead, every man aboard, from the captain down to the lowest green hand who had never before set foot on a ship, signed articles before departure that promised him a lay, a fixed fractional share of the entire voyage's net proceeds, whatever those proceeds turned out to be. The system had a certain rough logic to it. A voyage might return with 2,000 barrels of oil, or 200, and a lay system meant that everyone aboard, officers and crew alike, shared directly in that uncertainty, with better voyages making every share worth more and poor voyages making every share worth correspondingly less. In practice, the numbers worked out something like this. The Alcyon's owners, a partnership of 3 New Bedford merchants who had put up the capital to build and outfit the ship, a sum that could easily run past $30,000 once the vessel, her rigging, her whaleboats, her provisions for 4 years, and her advance wages to the crew were all accounted for, took by far the largest share of any successful voyage's profits. Often more than half. Captain Pierce's lay of 1/17th on a voyage that returned, say, 2,200 barrels of oil at $1 and change per gallon might net him something in the neighborhood of $2,000, a substantial sum for this era, enough to buy a comfortable house outright in a town like Fairhaven. The mates did considerably less well, their lays running somewhere between 1/25th and 1/40th, still enough to represent several $100s for a good voyage, meaningful money for a young man building toward eventually commanding his own ship. Boat steerers like Amos Weeks, whose skill with a harpoon directly determined how many whales the ship actually caught, earned lays around 1/80th, a recognition, however imperfect, of how much a single good harpooner's aim could matter to the entire voyage's outcome. And then there were men like Nathaniel, an able ordinary seaman rated at roughly 140th, and the green hands newer than him rated at 175th or worse. The numbers are worth pausing over, because they reveal something the popular imagination around whaling almost entirely misses. On a genuinely excellent voyage, a green hand's share of 2,000 barrels might net him $70 or $80 for 3.5 years of the hardest physical labor most of these young men would ever perform. On a mediocre voyage, that same share might come to $20 or less. To put these numbers beside something more familiar, a skilled shore laborer in New Bedford itself, a cooper working steadily in one of the town's own barrel shops, might earn something in the neighborhood of $1.25 a day, 6 days a week, which over the same 3.5 years Nathaniel's voyage will consume comes to a sum considerably larger and considerably more certain than most green hands or ordinary seamen can expect from their lay, whale prices and voyage length being what they are. This is not, on its face, a rational trade, and more than a few whaling agents of the period openly admitted as much when recruiting green hands fresh off farms in the Massachusetts interior, men who had rarely seen the ocean and had little basis for comparison. What the lay system offered instead of reliable pay was the possibility, statistically unlikely for any single voyage, of the occasional truly excellent haul that could pay a green hand's entire share out at several $100s rather than several dozen. A lottery dressed convincingly enough in the language of honest labor that generations of young men kept signing the articles anyway, decade after decade, each one privately certain his own voyage would be the good one. It helps too to see this system beside its closest rival. Nantucket, the older and smaller whaling port 30 miles out to sea from New Bedford, built its own fortune on nearly identical terms a full century before New Bedford ever launched a ship, and the two towns' owners studied each other's methods closely enough that a green hand's lay in one port rarely differed by more than a fraction from the same rating in the other. What varied more was outfitting cost, since a voyage of this length required an enormous initial outlay before a single barrel of oil ever came aboard. Casks and cordage and salt provisions and medicine and the whaleboats themselves, together running easily to $8,000 or $9,000 on top of the ship's own construction cost. All of it advanced by the owners, and all of it deducted, in effect, from the pool of proceeds that lays are calculated against before any individual share is ever paid out. Insurance, where owners chose to carry it, added a further cost again, a recognition, written into cold premium calculations of exactly how uncertain a 4-year voyage into unmapped whaling grounds actually was, no matter how confident any captain sounded before departure. None of this arithmetic reached the forecastle in any detailed form. Green hands signing the ship's articles in New Bedford rarely saw the owner's full account books and would not necessarily have understood them if they had. What they saw, instead, was a fraction, 1/175th, 1/200th, printed plainly enough on the page they were asked to sign, and a recruiting agent's confident assurance that the Alcyon, under a captain as steady as Aaron Pierce, was bound to return a good voyage. Whether that assurance held for any given man would not be known for 3.5 years, which is precisely long enough for a young man to marry the girl he left behind, or to lose her to someone with better prospects and considerably more patience for waiting. But the lay itself was never the whole story, and this is the part of the system that most retellings leave out entirely, perhaps because it complicates the simple picture of hard-working sailors earning their honest due. Before a ship even left port, most green hands and many ordinary seamen received an advance against their eventual lay, cash paid up front, typically used to buy clothing and gear for the voyage from the ship's own outfitter, at prices set by the outfitter and rarely favorable to the sailor. During the voyage itself, tobacco, extra clothing, thread, and small comforts were all available from the ship's slop chest, again on credit against the eventual lay, at markups that could run considerably higher than what the same goods cost on shore. A sailor who drew too freely against the slop chest across 4 years could arrive home, after all that labor, owing the ship's owners money rather than the reverse, a common enough outcome that whaling agents of the period referred to with a bluntness that has not survived into popular memory as coming home clean, meaning cleaned out. For Nathaniel, this meant a specific and careful arithmetic that occupied a fair amount of his private thinking, especially on quiet forenoons like the one just described. He had drawn against his lay before departure for a new set of oilskins and 2 changes of clothing, a debt of perhaps $11. He had, deliberately and with some pride, drawn almost nothing from the slop chest since, limiting himself to tobacco alone and rationing even that, because he had done the arithmetic himself, in his private log, more than once, and understood exactly how much of his eventual lay a single indulgent evening's extra tobacco purchase could quietly erase. There is more to understand here about why this system persisted despite its obvious unfairness to the men doing the most dangerous and exhausting labor aboard. Whaling voyages were a considerable financial gamble, 4 years of capital tied up in a single vessel with no guarantee of any return at all, and ship owners structured the lay system explicitly to shift as much of that risk as possible onto the crew, who had comparatively little bargaining power and, in a port like New Bedford at the height of the whaling boom, comparatively few other paths to any income at all. New Bedford, at this exact moment, is very likely the wealthiest city per person in the entire United States. Its counting houses and church spires and fine brick homes built almost entirely from the compounded profits of exactly this system, repeated across hundreds of ships and thousands of voyages, most of them, like the Alcyons, carrying green hands who understood only dimly, if at all, what fraction of the resulting fortune would eventually find its way into their own pocket. It is a pattern that shows up again and again in industries of this era, still recognizable today in slightly different clothing. The party financing an enterprise absorbs the comfortable portion of its risk and the largest portion of its reward, while the party performing the enterprise's actual physical labor absorbs the opposite, larger risk for a smaller and less certain reward. Whaling did not invent this arrangement. It simply made the arithmetic of it unusually easy to see, laid out in exact fractions in the ship's articles for any sailor patient enough to read them closely. Let us return now to the ship itself, and to a young man for whom none of this arithmetic is abstract, because he does it, quietly, almost every day, somewhere in the back of his mind, alongside the far more pleasant arithmetic of counting how many months remain before he sees Susanna Handy again. Just before noon, on every fair day of the voyage, a small ritual plays out on the Alcyon's quarterdeck that matters more to the ship's actual survival than almost anything else that happens aboard her. Captain Pierce, First Mate Gifford, and Second Mate Swain each climb to the deck carrying a brass sextant, an instrument that looks, to anyone unfamiliar with it, more like a piece of fine jewelry than a tool of navigation, and each man, independently, brings the sun down to the visible edge of the horizon through a small arc of mirrors and shaded glass, waiting for the precise moment the sun reaches its highest point in the sky. This is local apparent noon, the single most important navigational moment of any day at sea, and the 3 separate readings, compared and reconciled afterward in the captain's cabin against a chronometer kept carefully wound and a set of navigational tables thick as a family Bible, will tell the ship, within a mile or 2, exactly where on the vast blankness of the Pacific she currently sits. There is something almost devotional in the way this happens. 3 men standing a few feet apart, each silent, each utterly absorbed, angling a small brass instrument at the sun for perhaps 30 seconds, then lowering it and going below to do the arithmetic that turns an angle into a location. It is easy to forget, watching men do this so calmly, that without it, a ship this far from land would be, in the most literal sense, lost, with no way of knowing whether the nearest safe harbor lay 400 miles ahead or 400 miles behind. 8 bells rings at the stroke of noon, the loudest single ring of the ship's day, marking not only the hour but the change of watch and, not incidentally, the start of the crew's largest meal. Dinner, the whaleman's word for the midday meal, is more substantial than breakfast, though not by a great margin. Today it is salt pork, boiled for hours to soften meat that has spent months packed in brine, alongside a portion of duff, a dense, boiled pudding made from flour, a little fat, and whatever dried fruit remains in the ship's stores, sweetened, when molasses allows, into something the crew looks forward to rather than merely tolerates. Cook Freeman serves duff perhaps twice a week, and its appearance on a given day is, by long forecastle tradition, greeted with a small chorus of appreciative noise from whichever watch is eating first, a tradition Freeman himself pretends not to notice while visibly enjoying every time it happens. Nathaniel eats his dinner today seated on the deck near the tryworks, its brick furnace cold and unused for 19 days now, in the company of Jacinto and a green hand named Silas Turner, 17 years old, on his first voyage, still visibly uncertain about a great many things a man like Nathaniel now does without thinking. Silas asks, not for the first time, whether the ocean ever really frightens the older hands. And Jacinto, who has been at sea since he was younger than Silas is now, answers with the blunt honesty a genuine friendship allows. Not the ocean itself, he says. The ocean mostly does what oceans do, which is exist, indifferent to whoever happens to be floating on top of it. What frightens a sailor, if anything does, is usually something much smaller and much more specific. A rotten section of rope nobody caught in time, a careless moment near a whale's flukes, weather that turns faster than the barometer warned. Silas considers this for a while before admitting it makes the whole business sound, somehow, both less romantic and less terrifying than he had expected. The afternoon, like most afternoons on a whale-less stretch of ocean, belongs mostly to the men themselves. Once the ship's essential maintenance is finished, this is the hour of scrimshaw, and on the Alcyon's deck this afternoon, 6 men sit with sail needles and whale teeth or scraps of baleen, working slowly at designs ranging from simple ships to elaborate scenes copied from illustrated magazines that have circulated the forecastle so many times their pages have gone soft as cloth. Nathaniel works at his own piece for perhaps 40 minutes, adding careful, cautious lines to the cloud bank above his ship, before setting it aside, satisfied with the day's small progress and unwilling to risk a mistake by pushing further while his concentration frays. Elsewhere on deck, a game of checkers has drawn a small audience near the windlass, played on a board scratched directly into a section of planking with pieces cut from cork and dyed, half of them with tar. 2 of the Portuguese sailors sing quietly near the bow, a slow, minor key song in their own language that neither Nathaniel nor most of the Yankee crew understand a word of, though several of them have picked up the tune well enough to hum along, an odd informal harmony drifting across a deck where nobody planned for there to be music at all. A sailor mends a torn shirt with the same careful, patient stitches he might use on a torn sail. Because aboard a ship this far from any store, every piece of clothing a man owns must last considerably longer than its maker ever intended. Nathaniel's own reading, when the afternoon allows it, tends toward his father's old sea novel rather than anything newer, a book he has read 3 times now across 2 voyages and finds, each time, slightly different, the way a familiar piece of music sometimes reveals a phrase a listener had never quite noticed before. He reads perhaps 2 chapters this afternoon, seated with his back against a coil of spare cable, glancing up occasionally to check the sky or simply to let his eyes rest on the horizon for a while before returning to the page. A habit that has less to do with losing his place than with the simple pleasure of alternating between 2 kinds of distance, the invented one in the book and the real one stretching out past the rail. The singing near the bow continues on and off through the afternoon, and by 2 o'clock has drawn in 2 of the Yankee sailors as well, one of whom knows enough of the Portuguese tune's melody picked up across 3 years of shared voyages to hum a passable harmony beneath it, though he freely admits he has no idea what any of the words actually mean. Music aboard a whaling ship serves a purpose beyond simple entertainment, setting a shared rhythm for tasks that go easier with one. Hauling on a line, working a capstan, and the forecastle keeps a rough shared repertoire of such work songs, even among a crew this mixed in background. Tunes traded and altered slightly as they pass from one sailor's memory to another's, so that the version sung aboard the Alcyon this voyage already differs, in small ways nobody could trace exactly, from the version any of these men first learned as Green Hands. Near 2 in the afternoon, a cry from the masthead brings a brief flurry of attention, though not, today, for a whale, a waterspout. A slender, twisting column of cloud reaching down to touch the sea's surface, perhaps 2 miles off, has formed and is drifting slowly across the horizon, visible in its entirety, base to top. In a way, land dwellers almost never get to witness such things. Captain Pierce, alerted, watches it for several minutes through his glass with what looks, from a distance, like real scientific curiosity rather than concern, and orders no change of course, judging correctly that it will pass well clear of the ship. He calls Charlie Ames over with a crook of one finger and holds the instrument steady while the boy takes his own turn looking. A small, unbidden kindness that surprises nobody who has served under Pierce for any length of time, whatever complaints the crew otherwise nurses about his tobacco restrictions. He explains, in the plain, unhurried tone of a man who plainly enjoys being asked a good question, that the spout is simply wind and water finding each other in an unusual way, no more mysterious in its mechanics than a whirlpool, striking as it looks from a ship's deck. Charlie listens with the rapt attention of a boy who has decided, this voyage, that Captain Pierce knows everything worth knowing about the sea, an opinion several of the older hands find privately amusing, since they could each list, without much effort, at least one occasion when the captain's confident certainty about the weather had been proven flatly wrong within the hour. The men on deck watch it too, for as long as it lasts, a shared, wordless moment of simply looking at something strange and rather beautiful that the ocean has decided, for no reason anyone can determine, to produce this afternoon. Captain Pierce walks his own quarterdeck for a slow half-hour most afternoons, hands clasped loosely behind his back, saying little, though Nathaniel has learned to read the set of the captain's shoulders almost as well as he reads Amos Weeks's. Today the captain pauses near the mainmast, watching the waterspout dissipate on the horizon, and exchanges a few words with Nathaniel directly, asking after the state of the re-served mainstay from that morning's work. It is a small exchange, barely 30 seconds, the captain nodding once at Nathaniel's answer before moving on, but it is the kind of small exchange that matters aboard a ship where a captain's good opinion of a hand can eventually mean the difference between finishing a voyage as an ordinary seaman and finishing it on some future ship, as a boat steerer with a share of the profits worth having. Nathaniel does not dwell on it, but he does, quietly, note it in his private log that evening, one line among the others, because a captain's 30 seconds of attention is not nothing to a man watching his own slow climb through a hierarchy that rewards patience roughly as much as it rewards skill. The relationship runs the other direction too, in smaller ways easy to miss unless a person is looking for them. When Silas Turner, still learning the ship's countless unwritten rules, coils a line incorrectly near the binnacle, it is Nathaniel, not an officer, who quietly recoils it properly and shows the boy the right method, sparing him a mate's sharper correction in front of the watch. It is a small kindness, repeated in some version nearly every day aboard every ship of this kind. Ordinary seamen absorbing the mistakes of Green Hands before those mistakes can become the kind of visible failure that earns a man a reputation he will carry the rest of the voyage. There is a persistent idea, repeated often enough in popular accounts of whaling, that it has hardened into something close to accepted fact, that months at sea with the same 32 men, out of sight of land, drove sailors toward isolation, quiet madness, a slow fraying of the mind under the weight of monotony and confinement. It is worth pausing on this, because the actual record, the journals and logs these men kept, tells a rather different story more often than not. What develops aboard a ship like the Alcyone, across months of shared close quarters, tends to look considerably more like family than like isolation. An intimacy built less on any particular affection between individual men, though that exists too, than on the sheer accumulated weight of shared routine, shared danger on the rare days danger actually arrives, shared jokes worn smooth from repetition, and a kind of forced, thorough knowledge of each other's habits that few relationships on land ever require. Nathaniel could tell you, without having to think about it, exactly how Jacinto takes his coffee, exactly which of Silas Turner's jokes never quite land, exactly how Amos Weeks stands when he is troubled about something he has not yet said aloud. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely. The danger these men actually feared, most days, was not the loneliness of the sea. It was, far more often, simply being ordinary and unremarkable in front of 31 other men they would be living beside for 3 more years. Later in the afternoon, in a rare quiet half-hour before the dog watch, Nathaniel takes out Susanna's most recent letter again, though he could recite it by now without looking, and reads it once more anyway, slowly, the way a person returns to a favorite room in a house rather than because there is anything left to discover in it. He finds himself thinking less about the words themselves than about her hands on the pianoforte keys, an instrument he has never once seen her touch. Imagining fingers he knows well from letters and from memory finding their way, slowly and probably imperfectly, across notes he cannot begin to picture. It is a small, private, faintly foolish pleasure, imagining a scene he has no actual evidence for, and he indulges it anyway. Because a voyage this long survives, in no small part, on exactly this kind of careful, deliberate imagining. By 4, the first dog watch begins, a shortened 2-hour shift that exists purely to rotate which men stand which hours from one day to the next, and the afternoon's loose, unhurried rhythm starts, very gradually, to gather itself toward evening. This is one of those moments where a small detail, a young sailor imagining a woman's hands on an instrument he has never seen, tells a bigger story about how whalemen actually survived voyages that could run past 4 years without a single visit home. Let us look, for a while, at the wider structures, medical, religious, and social, that shaped every man's experience aboard a ship like the Alcyone. Because Nathaniel's afternoon daydream belongs to a much larger pattern than his alone. Start with the crew itself. Because the Alcyone's mixture of backgrounds was not unusual for a whaling ship of this period, and understanding it corrects one of the more persistent misconceptions about who actually did this work. Popular memory tends to picture a whaling crew as uniformly Yankee, white, and Protestant, an image drawn largely from a single famous novel and reinforced by a century of illustrations. The historical record tells a considerably more complicated story. New Bedford's whaling fleet, at the height of the industry, drew crew from an unusually wide range of backgrounds for mid-19th century America. Cape Verdean and Azorean Portuguese sailors recruited directly at ports of call in the eastern Atlantic, free black sailors from New Bedford and New York who found at sea wages and treatment considerably fairer than most work available to them on land, and Native American sailors, especially from Martha's Vineyard and the Wampanoag communities of Gay Head and Chappaquiddick, whose skill with a harpoon and generations of whaling knowledge made them some of the most sought-after boat steerers in the entire industry. Amos Weeks belongs to exactly this tradition, one considerably older than the Yankee whaling industry itself, since Wampanoag whalemen were hunting whales from the shore of Martha's Vineyard long before any New Bedford ship existed to hire them. This did not make the ship a place of equality. Discipline aboard was strict and, by any modern standard, harsh, resting entirely on the captain's authority, which the law of the sea backed almost without limit. A captain could order a man flogged for serious insubordination, though by 1849 such punishments had grown rarer than in earlier decades. partly due to changing law and partly due to a growing recognition among owners that a badly treated crew made for a poorly run ship. Most discipline in practice took gentler forms: an extra watch assigned, a tobacco ration withheld. The kind of restriction Nathaniel privately resents in Captain Pierce without ever voicing it aloud. But within this rigid hierarchy, the close, shared conditions of the forecastle produced a rough camaraderie across lines that would have kept these same men considerably more separated on land. Portuguese and Yankee and Wampanoag and free black sailors sharing meals, songs, watches, and the accumulated small intimacies of shared hardship in a way New Bedford's own streets, still segregated in countless unofficial ways, rarely allowed. Health at sea depended almost entirely on the captain, who typically served as the ship's only physician, guided by a wooden medicine chest supplied before departure and a manual of instructions written for laymen rather than trained doctors. Captain Pierce's chest holds laudanum for pain, quinine against fever, a supply of citric acid and preserved lime juice to guard against scurvy, a lesson the whaling industry had learned thoroughly enough by this period that outright scurvy, so devastating to earlier generations of long-distance sailors, had become genuinely rare aboard well-provisioned ships like this one. More common were injuries: a crushed finger from a straining line, a fall from the rigging, the occasional serious wound from whaling itself when the ship's luck turned, treated as best the captain's limited training allowed, sometimes with results a modern doctor would find alarming, sometimes, remarkably often, with results good enough that the man recovered fully and returned to work within weeks. Diet, too, shaped health aboard in ways the crew understood only partially, working more from generations of accumulated maritime habit than from any formal medical theory. Preserved lime juice, issued in small regular doses once the ship had been at sea more than a few weeks, kept scurvy at bay well enough that most sailors of this generation had never personally witnessed the disease's worst stages, a real improvement over the experience of whalemen only 2 or 3 generations earlier. Though nobody aboard the Alcyon could have explained precisely why the lime juice worked, only that ships which issued it steadily lost fewer men than ships which did not. Fresh provisions, taken aboard whenever the ship called at a port or an island, mattered just as much, which is part of why a stop for tortoises in the Galapagos, strange as it might look to modern eyes, functioned as a valued piece of the crew's own health, a floating larder of meat that needed no salt and no barrel, requiring only a dark corner of the hold and an occasional feeding of whatever greenery could be spared. Religion structured the ship's calendar more gently than its discipline structured the crew's behavior, but it structured it nonetheless. Sunday, when weather and duty allowed, brought a lighter workload and, for a captain inclined toward it, a short service read aloud from a Bible kept in his cabin, a practice Captain Pierce observes with quiet, unshowy conviction most weeks. Back in New Bedford, the sailors' own church, a modest chapel known locally as the Seaman's Bethel, keeps a wall lined with marble memorials to men lost at sea, a tradition every whaleman aboard the Alcyon knows of, whether or not he has ever set foot inside the building himself, and more than one sailor aboard privately hopes, without ever saying so, that his own name will never need adding to that wall. It is worth pausing, too, on the women left waiting in towns like Fairhaven and New Bedford, since their experience of a voyage like this one, though it happens entirely on land, shaped the whaling economy nearly as thoroughly as anything occurring at sea. A sailmaker's household like the Handys depended, in Susanna's father's absence, from any ship of his own, on steady shore trade. But a great many New Bedford households depended directly on a husband's or a son's or a fiancé's lay, arriving irregularly and unpredictably across years rather than months. Which meant that women across this town became, of practical necessity, careful and often quite sophisticated household managers, stretching an advance payment or a partial remittance across a year or more of uncertain income in a way that would impress any modern household budget. Some kept careful ledgers of their own, tracking exactly which whaling agent owed what against which voyage, and more than a few New Bedford wives and daughters were known to walk into a shipping office themselves when a payment ran late. A fact that sits somewhat awkwardly beside this era's more general assumptions about which sphere belonged to which sex. Susanna Handy manages her father's accounts in something like this same spirit, and Nathaniel, thinking of her this way, feels less like a man leaving a delicate girl behind, and more like a man whose absence simply shifts certain responsibilities onto shoulders he trusts completely to carry them. It is not the picture of waiting womanhood that popular songs about sailors tend to paint, forlorn and passive at some window overlooking the harbour. It is, more accurately, a picture of a household run in careful, deliberate partnership across a distance that letters alone can only imperfectly bridge. Alcohol occupied an uneasy place aboard ships of this era, caught between old tradition and a temperance movement gathering real force on shore throughout the 1840s. Many owners, Captain Pierce's among them, had begun outfitting their ships entirely dry, no daily grog ration at all. A policy justified partly by genuine religious conviction and partly by the plainer commercial logic that a sober crew handled valuable whaleboats and sharp harpoons more safely than a crew accustomed to rum. Sailors of an older generation sometimes grumbled about the change, missing a ritual their fathers had taken for granted. Younger hands like Nathaniel, who came up entirely within the dry tradition, mostly accept it as simply how things are. One more rule among the many that structure a life this tightly bound by rule. Literacy varied considerably across the crew, and it mattered more than almost any other single skill a man could bring aboard, because a ship's entire connection to the world beyond her own deck, letters home, letters received, the private log Nathaniel keeps, the ship's own official log Captain Pierce maintains daily, ran entirely through the written word. A sailor who could read and write well, as Nathaniel can, carried an advantage that had nothing directly to do with sailing skill and everything to do with maintaining the thin, fragile thread connecting him to a life on land that continued, unseen, month after month, whether or not he was there to witness it. Letters themselves moved slowly and unpredictably, carried not by any regular postal system, but by whatever ship happened to be homeward bound when two vessels met at sea for a gam, the whaling term for the social visit two ships might exchange when their courses crossed. Crews rowing between vessels to trade news, mail, and the simple pleasure of unfamiliar faces after months of seeing only the same 31 men. It was exactly such a gam, 5 months earlier, that carried Susanna's most recent letter into Nathaniel's hands, and it will very likely be another such chance meeting, rather than any scheduled delivery that eventually carries his reply back toward her. It would be dishonest to suggest whaling carried no real risk at all, and the honest version of this story never promised danger did not exist, only that it was rare rather than constant. A whaling voyage of this era carried meaningfully higher mortality than an equivalent stretch of years spent ashore, drowning, disease picked up at foreign ports, and the occasional genuine catastrophe during an actual chase all took their toll across the whaling fleet as a whole. But the honest arithmetic of an individual day aboard the Alcyone looks nothing like the version built from a single famous shipwreck. On the vast majority of the roughly 1,300 days this voyage will eventually total, the greatest danger any man aboard actually faces is a rope burn, a strained back, or, on an afternoon like this one, mild sunburn from an unusually clear sky. Risk aboard a ship like this was real, cumulative, and significant across an entire industry. It was not, on any given ordinary evening, something pressing at the front of anyone's mind. There is more to understand here about what all of this meant for a man like Nathaniel specifically. He survives this voyage, psychologically as much as physically, through a structure built from several overlapping systems at once, a rigid but broadly fair hierarchy that rewards patience, a religious rhythm that marks Sundays as gently different from every other day, a body of medical knowledge good enough to handle most ordinary injury and illness, and a fragile, slow, deeply valued thread of written correspondence that connects him, however imperfectly, to Susanna Handy, and to a version of home that continues existing whether or not he can currently see it. None of these systems, individually, would be enough to sustain a person through 3.5 years of confinement and hard labor. Together, they form something that functioned, for most of the men aboard, most of the time, well enough to get them home. Let us return now to the ship's own afternoon, where the first dog watch has just begun, the sun still an hour or more from setting, and Nathaniel's day, far from over, is only now approaching the hours this story actually set out to spend with him. The sun begins its final descent around 6 in the evening, and for the better part of an hour, the sky performs the kind of unhurried, wide-open show that only a horizon with nothing on it, no hills, no buildings, no trees, can properly stage. It moves through gold, then a deep orange that catches every scattered cloud low in the west, then a soft violet that spreads slowly upward from the horizon like ink finding its way through water. Nathaniel watches most of it from the rail during the second dog watch, his shift on deck running from 6 until 8, the 2-hour window that exists solely to keep the ship's watch rotation from repeating itself identically day after day. The sea beneath all of this remains almost perfectly calm, its surface catching the sky's colors in long, slow bands that bend and reform with every gentle swell, so that looking down at the water feels, for a while, almost like looking down at the sky's reflection rather than at the ocean at all. Somewhere behind him, faint but carrying easily across still air, drifts the smell of the galley stove, its last coals still warm from dinner, mixed now with the sharper scent of the tar Cook Freeman uses to seal a leaking seam in the water cask lashed near the try-works. It is a small, homely smell, oddly comforting against the enormous backdrop of open ocean and darkening sky. The plain proof that inside all this vastness sits one small, warm, human-made space still quietly tending to itself. 8 bells brings the change to the first watch, Nathaniel's own watch, larboard, taking the deck for the 4 hours between 8 and midnight, precisely the watch we met him standing near the rail for at the very start of this evening. The sun is gone now, fully, the last colour draining from the western sky, and the total darkness of a clear night far from any city settles over the ship the way it settles nowhere else most people will ever experience. A darkness so complete and so free of any competing light that the stars, once the eye adjusts, arrive in numbers that can feel. The first several times a person sees them from mid-ocean, almost overwhelming. Nathaniel stopped finding it overwhelming somewhere in his first voyage. Tonight, he simply looks up for a while, the way a person looks at something familiar and still, despite the familiarity, deeply beautiful. Cook Freeman, below in the galley, uses this same quiet hour to bank his fire properly for the night, raking the coals into a careful bed that will hold enough heat to have coffee ready before the morning watch, without ever risking a stray spark aboard a wooden ship soaked, in places, with whale oil. It is one of the more anxious responsibilities on the entire vessel, fire being the one genuine catastrophe every whaleman fears more than any weather or any whale, and Freeman performs his nightly ritual with a care bordering on reverence, checking the damper twice, wetting down the area around the stove out of long habit, before he finally allows himself to climb into his own bunk. Nathaniel, passing the galley door on his way forward, catches the smell of banked coals and boiled coffee grounds, a smell so specifically tied to the end of the working day that he suspects, decades from now, it will still be capable of returning him instantly to nights exactly like this one. The wind stays light, barely enough to keep the topsails drawing, and the ship's motion settles into the slow, rolling rhythm that becomes, across a long voyage, almost indistinguishable from stillness itself. A gentle lean to one side, a pause, a gentle lean back, over and over, on a cycle long enough that a person's body stops registering it as motion and starts registering it instead as simply the shape the world happens to take. Overhead, the rigging keeps up its own quiet, constant conversation. Hemp lines easing and tightening with each small shift of the hull. A low creak here. A soft groan there, individually meaningless sounds that together add up to something closer to a voice than to noise. The specific voice of a large wooden object finding, moment to moment, its own patient balance against the sea. Most of the first watch's duties tonight are light. A man at the wheel, holding a heading given by the mate. 2 lookouts, though on a night this dark, and with the ship's boats secured for the evening, their job has less to do with spotting whales, which cannot be hunted after dark in any case, than with simply watching for any other vessel that might cross paths with the Alcyon in the darkness. A genuine, if rare, hazard on well-travelled whaling grounds like this one. The rest of the watch has real, unhurried time to simply be present on deck, and this, more than the noon sight or the dinner or the afternoon's leisure, is the hour of the day the men aboard seem to treasure most, though few of them, if asked, would think to describe it that way. Below, in the forecastle, the watch below decks is settling into its own version of the same evening. Let us climb down that ladder now, into the warm, close, lantern-lit space where roughly half the crew spends its off hours, because the texture of this room at 8 in the evening tells its own part of the story. A single oil lamp, its flame small and steady in the still air below deck, throws soft, moving light across a room that smells, more strongly here than anywhere else on the ship, of oak, of cedar, of pipe smoke curling up from 2 or 3 men settled onto their sea chests with their pipes lit, and under all of it the same wool and salt and tar smell that clings to every piece of clothing any of these men own. A sailor named Tobias, one of the Cape Verdean crew, sits near the lamp with a needle and a torn section of canvas sail across his knees, his stitches slow even. Unpracticed, mending a rip that will be needed again the next time this same sail is set. Beside him, another man works a piece of scrimshaw not unlike Nathaniel's, though his design shows a house rather than a ship. A house, he describes, when asked, in enough careful detail that everyone in the forecastle now feels they could walk through its rooms themselves despite having never seen it. There is a certain kind of security in this room worth pausing over, because it runs almost exactly opposite to what a person unfamiliar with life at sea might expect. Outside, in every direction, lies an ocean whose actual size is difficult for anyone to hold properly in mind. Indifferent, unmeasured, entirely unconcerned with the fate of 104 feet of oak and canvas currently crossing a tiny fraction of it. And yet inside this room, surrounded by that same ocean, the feeling most men report, in their letters and their private logs, is not fear but a kind of settled safety, built from the simple, repeated physical fact of a well-built ship holding steady beneath them, night after night, exactly as she has held steady for the better part of a year already. The Alcyon's ribs, oak grown thick and slow in a New England forest, decades before any of these men were born, creak softly with every roll, a sound every man aboard has learned, whether consciously or not, to hear as reassurance rather than threat, the deep-spoken language of a sturdy vessel simply doing what she was built to do. Nathaniel spends the early part of his watch near the helm, close enough to Amos Weeks, who is standing his own turn at the wheel tonight, to talk quietly, without either man needing to raise his voice against any wind, because there is barely any wind to raise a voice against. Amos holds the wheel with the loose, unhurried grip of a man who has done this so many times that his hands make small corrections almost before his mind consciously registers the need for them. Easing the spokes a touch to windward, feeling the ship answer, easing back. He tells Nathaniel about a whale he once helped bring alongside off the coast of his own home waters near Gay Head, years before he ever sailed on a Yankee ship at all, a story Nathaniel has heard some version of at least 4 times now and still enjoys exactly as much as the first. because Amos tells it slightly differently each time, adding some new small detail he had apparently forgotten to mention before. Near 10, the wake behind the ship begins, faintly at first, and then unmistakably, to glow. It is bioluminescence, countless single-celled organisms disturbed by the passage of the hull and stirred, in response, into a soft, cold blue light that traces the ship's path across the black water like a long, slowly fading ribbon. Nathaniel leans over the taffrail to watch it, as he does most calm nights, and tonight the display is unusually strong. Bright enough that individual swirls and eddies in the water show clearly. Bright enough that when a curious dolphin, drawn by the same disturbance, cuts briefly across the wake below, its entire path lights up for a moment in a streak of pale blue fire before fading back into ordinary darkness. There is no scientific explanation Nathaniel could offer for this, and he does not much want one tonight. He simply watches it, the way a person watches a fire burn down, finding something in the plain fact of it that asks nothing more than to be observed. 8 bells sounds again, marking 10 o'clock. And then again at 11, the ship's slow measured count continuing its patient way through the night exactly as it has continued through every night of this voyage and every night of hundreds of voyages before it. Above, the sky has turned fully dark now, moonless tonight, which makes the stars correspondingly fierce, and directly off the starboard bow, low but unmistakable, sits the North Star, the one fixed point in an entire turning sky. The star every navigator on every ship crossing this ocean eventually learns to find without thinking, because a ship's whole sense of direction, however many brass instruments and careful calculations support it, still ultimately rests on the simple, ancient comfort of one light that never moves. Midnight arrives with 8 bells struck in their full sequence, the traditional signal marking not only the hour but the change from the first watch to the middle watch. Larboard giving way to starboard exactly as it did 20 hours ago, exactly as it will do again tomorrow, and every day remaining in this voyage. Nathaniel's watch is done. He stands for a moment longer near the compass, its small housing lit from within by a single dim lamp so the helmsman can read the card without ruining his night vision. Watching the needle hold its patient line while Amos weaks, staying on a while past the formal change simply because he is not yet tired, keeps the wheel with the same loose, easy hands he has held it with all watch. The stillness at midnight aboard a calm ship is its own particular thing, distinct from the stillness of any other hour, a hush that seems to include the whole visible universe, water below, stars above, and 32 men scattered between them, awake or asleep, all held for this 1 hour in something that feels, if a person lets it, remarkably close to peace. Below, the forecastle has gone mostly quiet by now, most of the off-watch already settled into their hammocks, canvas cocoons slung on ropes from the deck beams overhead, each man's hammock swaying gently in whatever small motion the ship makes. A rhythm every sailor learns, usually within his first difficult week at sea, to stop fighting and start simply riding. Nathaniel climbs down the ladder quietly, careful not to wake anyone sleeping soundly already, and makes his way to his own hammock, slung between 2 oak beams near the forward bulkhead, close enough to Jacinto's that the 2 hammocks occasionally brush in the night without either man waking for it. He undresses to his shirt, folding his jacket carefully and tucking it where it will stay dry, and climbs into the hammock with the practiced, economical motion of a man who has done this several hundred times now. One hand steadying the canvas, a shift of weight, and then he is in, the hammock swinging once, twice, before settling into its own small rhythm that matches almost exactly the larger rhythm of the ship itself, rolling on the swell outside. He pulls a wool blanket up over his shoulders against the cool night air drifting down through the open hatch above, air that carries with it, faintly, the salt smell of the sea and, even fainter, the last traces of pipe smoke from whoever smoked topside during the second dog watch. Somewhere further down the row of hammocks, Elias Dunham the carpenter turns over once, murmurs something indistinct, and settles again, a man whose sleep, built on a clear conscience about the state of the ship's boats, comes easily most nights. Tobias, the Cape Verdean sailor who mended sailcloth earlier in the evening, has already fallen asleep with his half-finished mending still folded neatly beside him, needle safely stuck through the fabric where his fingers will find it again first thing tomorrow. The forecastle, taken as a whole at this hour, holds 16 versions of the same trust, in the ship, in the watch standing above them, in the simple accumulated fact of hundreds of previous nights that ended, every one of them, in a safe and ordinary morning. For a while, before sleep actually arrives, Nathaniel lies in the suspended comfort of a hammock at sea, weightless in a way no bed on land ever quite manages, cradled rather than merely supported, swaying in gentle counterpoint to the ship's own slow roll so that the two motions, hammock and hull, seem to cancel each other into something calmer than either alone. He thinks, as he often does in this exact quiet stretch between waking and sleep, about Susanna, about the pianoforte, about the scrimshaw tooth still unfinished in his sea chest, about how many more nights like this one stand between him and the wharf he left from. He does the arithmetic without really trying to, the way his mind does most nights now, and arrives, as he usually does, at a number large enough to be daunting and small enough, somehow, to still feel like something he can simply wait through, one watch at a time. The sounds that carry him the rest of the way towards sleep are the same sounds that have carried him towards sleep on hundreds of nights before this one, and will carry him for hundreds more before the voyage ends. The creak of oak ribs working gently against the sea, the low hiss of water along the hull, rising and falling with each small change in the ship's speed, the soft, steady rhythm of another sailor's breathing from the hammock nearest his own. Somewhere above, faint through the hatch, the quiet murmur of the middle watch keeping its own patient hour, and beneath everything, the vast, indifferent, oddly comforting fact of an entire ocean holding this one small wooden world steady upon its back. Nathaniel is asleep before 8 bells rings again. Now, the larger currents moving beneath this ship deserve their own unhurried explanation, because 1849 is a peculiar moment to be living the specific life Nathaniel Cobb is living, poised at the edge of changes that none of the 32 men aboard the Alcyon can yet fully see coming, though several of the forces already exist, quietly, in the world they left behind. Consider first the industry itself. American whaling, in 1849, sits close to its absolute peak. New Bedford alone home to a fleet of well over 300 vessels, the largest whaling port in the entire world. Its wharves and warehouses and counting houses built on a business that has, by this point, been expanding for the better part of a century. Sperm whale oil lights lamps across America and much of Europe. Whalebone, the flexible baleen taken from certain species, stiffens corsets and hoop skirts and buggy whips in a dozen industries that have nothing directly to do with the ocean at all. It would be difficult, standing on the Alcyon's deck this July evening, to imagine any force strong enough to end an industry this thoroughly woven into the world's daily life. And yet, roughly a decade after this voyage returns to New Bedford, in a small town in western Pennsylvania that none of these 32 men will ever have reason to visit, a man will drill the first successful oil well specifically intended to extract petroleum from the ground. And within another decade beyond that, refined kerosene, cheaper and more plentiful than whale oil could ever be, will begin displacing it from lamps across the same cities the Alcyon's cargo currently lights. The industry that has made New Bedford the wealthiest city per person in America will not vanish overnight. But its long, slow decline, invisible from this deck tonight, is already closer than anyone aboard could reasonably guess. A strange thing to consider about an evening that otherwise feels, in every sensory detail, timeless and unhurried. There is a second change already moving, more slowly but just as surely, through the world these sailors left behind, and it concerns who gets to go to sea at all. It has become, in these very years, slightly more common, though still unusual enough to draw comment, for a captain's wife to accompany her husband on a whaling voyage, sharing his cabin for years at a stretch, rather than waiting ashore the entire time as women in her position had done for generations before her. A handful of these women have begun keeping their own journals of these voyages, detailed, literate, often quietly funny accounts of life aboard ship from a perspective the historical record had almost entirely lacked before this era. Accounts that will eventually give later generations a far richer picture of exactly the kind of evening we have spent tonight than the ship's own official log, concerned mostly with wind and position and whales, ever could. No captain's wife sails aboard the Alcyon this voyage. But the practice is spreading, quietly, ship by ship. And within another generation it will be common enough that nobody thinks to remark on it at all. A third change concerns the men themselves, or rather the world waiting for them when they finally do return. The 1840s are a decade of real ferment on the American mainland, a growing and increasingly organized movement against slavery gaining real force in exactly the cities, Boston, New Bedford, New York, that these sailors call home. A movement in which New Bedford's own free black community, some of whose members serve alongside Nathaniel right now as full and respected members of this crew, plays a significant part. The relative equality these men experience aboard ship, imperfect and hierarchical as it remains, exists in an odd, temporary bubble compared to the world on shore, where the same men returning from this voyage will step back into a country still years away from resolving the question that will eventually, within little more than a decade, tear it apart entirely. It is one of the more striking features of a whaling crew like this one, examined honestly, that the deck of a ship built to extract profit through some of the hardest labor available in this era also happened, almost incidentally, to be one of the more genuinely integrated workplaces in all of mid-century America. A fact none of these men would have described in those terms, but one the historical record makes difficult to miss. Consider, too, what this shift will eventually mean for the children these sailors do not yet have. Nathaniel and Susanna's own children, when they eventually arrive, will grow up in a New Bedford still built on whaling money but increasingly diversified into textile manufacturing and rail investment, hedging, almost without anyone framing it that way, against a decline in the old industry that owners more attuned to the signs have already begun quietly anticipating. Those children will likely never spend 3.5 years aboard a wooden ship chasing sperm whales across the Pacific, not because the work will have become less profitable exactly, though eventually it will, but because the entire shape of the world they inherit, lit increasingly by kerosene rather than whale oil, connected increasingly by rail and telegraph rather than by the slow, uncertain arrival of a homeward-bound ship at a gam 5 months out, will simply offer them paths their father never had available to choose between. Even the whales themselves are part of this quietly shifting picture. Decades of intensive hunting across the Atlantic and the nearer reaches of the Pacific have already pushed American whaling fleets further and further from home in search of sperm whales still numerous enough to hunt profitably, which is precisely why the offshore ground exists as a destination at all, and precisely why, within another decade or two, fleets will be pushing even further into the Arctic waters off Alaska, chasing an animal that is growing, gradually and almost imperceptibly to anyone aboard any single voyage, harder to find than it was when this industry began. There is a fourth change, smaller than the others, but perhaps closer to home for a man like Nathaniel, concerning how a voyage like this one gets remembered at all. The private logs kept by ordinary sailors, Nathaniel's included, are rarely preserved with any care once a voyage ends, tucked into an attic trunk or lost outright within a generation or two, while a captain's official log, or the more polished journal kept by an educated officer's wife, stands a considerably better chance of eventually reaching a library shelf or a historical society's archive. This means the version of whaling that survives into later centuries skews, in ways almost nobody making that record ever intended, toward the perspective of those already positioned above the forecastle. A captain's certainty, an officer's authority, rather than the quieter daily experience of the green hands and ordinary seamen who actually made up most of any crew. It is one of the quieter reasons the popular imagination of a ship like the Alcyone leans so heavily toward drama and command, and so lightly toward holystone decks and scrimshaw and a young man reading the same 3 letters for the 40th time. The record simply survived unevenly, favoring the voices with better paper, better ink, and better odds of a descendant who thought to keep the box. There is a certain kind of vertigo in recognizing how completely this moment sits inside its own bubble of time, confident in its own permanence the way most moments of genuine prosperity tend to feel from the inside. New Bedford's whaling merchants in 1849 have every reason to believe their industry's dominance will simply continue, since it has continued, growing steadily, for the better part of 2 generations already, through wars, through economic panics, through every previous challenge the industry has faced. The specific threat that will actually end it, a black, foul-smelling liquid seeping out of the ground in rural Pennsylvania, would have struck any of these merchants, had you described it to them this July evening, as considerably less plausible than almost any other imaginable disruption to their business. This is, in its own way, a pattern worth sitting with honestly. The forces that eventually reorganize an entire way of life rarely announce themselves clearly in advance, and rarely arrive from the direction anyone standing inside that way of life happens to be watching. None of this touches tonight's watch directly. The wind is still light. The sea is still calm. Amos Weeks still holds the wheel with the same loose, unhurried hands he has held it with for years. But it is worth knowing, as we return to this quiet, ordinary evening one final time, that the world holding it, on every side, on shore and at sea alike, is already beginning to move. Step back now from this one July evening, and a handful of patterns emerge from it that reach considerably beyond a single ship, a single voyage, or even the whaling industry itself, patterns worth naming plainly because they say something true about the wider shape of a human life lived under conditions of extended obligation. The first is what we might call the density of small obligation. Nothing about Nathaniel's day, examined moment by moment, looks especially heavy. A watch stood, a deck scrubbed, rope spliced, a meal eaten, a tooth carved, a few careful lines at a time. And yet the sum of these small obligations, repeated daily across 3.5 years with almost no interruption, no weekend, no true day off, no possibility of simply deciding tomorrow will be different, constitutes a form of labor considerably heavier than any single task within it suggests. This is a pattern that shows up wherever people live inside a structure they cannot easily step outside of. A farm, a factory, a household, a ship. The weight is rarely in any one obligation. It is in the accumulation and in the near total absence of any exit from the accumulation, for years at a stretch. The second pattern concerns the invisibility of maintenance. If you had asked most people, before tonight, to describe what a whaling voyage consisted of, the answer would almost certainly have centered on the chase itself. The boats lowered, the harpoon thrown. The dramatic and dangerous work that occupied, by even a generous accounting, perhaps a few dozen days out of more than 1,000. The other days, the holystone decks and re-served rigging and mended sails, the actual overwhelming majority of the voyage, rarely make it into any retelling at all. Because maintenance, everywhere it occurs, tends to be the part of any enterprise that becomes visible only when it fails. Nobody writes songs about the rope that did not part. Nobody paints the deck that stayed properly caulked. And yet it was precisely this invisible, unglamorous, endlessly repeated labor that kept this ship, and every ship like her, afloat and functioning for the years such voyages required. The third pattern is the economics of risk transferred downward, a structure we examined closely earlier through the ley system, but one worth naming again here in its broader form. The men who financed the Alcyon's voyage, safe ashore in New Bedford's brick counting houses, risked capital they could, in the worst case, afford to lose without it costing them their health or their years. The men who actually sailed the ship risked exactly those things: their bodies, their safety, 3.5 irretrievable years of their own lives, for a share of the proceeds calculated, quite deliberately, to leave the greater portion of the reward with the party who had risked the least. This pattern of risk flowing toward those with the least power to refuse it, while reward flows the opposite direction, recurs across an enormous range of human economic arrangements, then and now. And the ley system's unusual clarity, its precise fractions written plainly into a ship's articles for any sailor patient enough to read them, simply makes an arrangement that is often hidden in other contexts unusually easy to see. The fourth pattern is the discipline of routine as a genuine buffer against fear. An ocean the size of the one surrounding the Alcyon tonight is, considered honestly, an overwhelming fact, vast beyond any comfortable human scale, entirely indifferent to the fate of the small wooden object currently crossing it. And yet almost nobody aboard, on an ordinary calm night like this one, spends any real time actually confronting that vastness directly. Because the ship's rigid structure of bells and watches and assigned tasks gives every man something considerably smaller and more manageable to hold his attention instead. A watch to stand, a line to splice, a meal to eat at a fixed hour. The scale of the actual situation, 104 feet of wood surrounded by thousands of miles of open ocean, gets quietly absorbed and diffused by a structure of small, repeated, achievable tasks in a pattern that shows up, in gentler form, in almost anyone's life during periods that would otherwise feel unbearably large. Illness, grief, any stretch of time whose true scale is easier to survive one manageable piece at a time than confront it all at once. The fifth pattern, and perhaps the quietest one, is the mediated nature of the relationships that matter most. Nathaniel's connection to Susanna Handy, arguably the single most important relationship in his life at this moment, exists almost entirely through paper. 7 letters read 40 times each. A scrimshaw tooth carved slowly toward a design he hopes will please her, an imagined pianoforte he has never heard her play. This is not a diminished form of love, exactly, though it asks something different of the person living inside it. A willingness to sustain deep feeling through absence and delay and imagination rather than through daily presence. It is a pattern considerably older and considerably more common than most people, accustomed to instant contact across any distance, tend to remember the long human history of relationships carried for months or years across silence, sustained by nothing more than paper, memory, and a disciplined, deliberate act of imagining the other person clearly enough to keep loving them in their absence. There is a sixth thing worth naming, quieter than the other 5 and harder to state as cleanly, which is simply the dignity available inside constraint. Nathaniel did not choose the ley system, did not choose the watch bill, did not choose how many years separate him from Susanna Handy, and could not, aboard this ship, choose very much at all about the shape of his days. And yet within that narrow, rigidly bounded space, he has built something that looks, examined closely, remarkably like a full life. A craft he is slowly mastering in the scrimshaw tooth. A friendship with Jacinto built from nothing but proximity and time. A private discipline around his own small debts and his own private log. A patient, deliberate way of loving a woman he cannot see. None of this required more freedom than the ship allowed him. It required only the willingness to use, fully and carefully, whatever freedom remained. Taken together, these patterns describe something larger than one sailor's evening aboard one ship in one specific year. They describe a way of living inside structure, obligation, risk, routine, and distance that has, in one form or another, shaped an enormous share of human experience across most of history, and that a single calm night aboard the Alcyon happens to illustrate with unusual clarity, precisely because so little else was happening to obscure it. Somewhere past 1 in the morning, the ship is as quiet as a vessel carrying 32 living men and a full spread of canvas can ever really become. The middle watch holds the deck above, 4 men keeping their patient rounds beneath a sky that has not changed its arrangement of stars in any way a casual glance could detect since midnight. Below, in the forecastle, 16 hammocks sway in their own private rhythms, slightly out of step with each other, so that the room's overall motion, if you could somehow see it all at once, would look less like a single wave and more like a loose, unhurried conversation between 32 shoulders and the sea beneath them. Nathaniel sleeps on his back, one arm fallen outside the hammock's edge, his breathing slow and even, matched loosely to the ship's own roll in the way a person's breathing sometimes falls into step with any sufficiently patient rhythm nearby. On the small shelf built into the hull beside his bunk, his sea chest sits closed, Susanna's letters wrapped safe inside their scrap of oiled canvas, the unfinished scrimshaw tooth resting on top of his folded shirts where he left it after this afternoon's work, its half-rendered cloud bank still waiting for whatever careful lines tomorrow's spare hour might add. His private log lies beside it, tonight's entry already written before he climbed into the hammock. 3 lines, weather fair, position roughly 400 miles west of the Peruvian coast. No whale sighted in 19 days. And beneath that, 1 further line, smaller than the others, about the particular blue of the bioluminescence in tonight's wake, a detail he suspects Susanna will want more than she will ever want the latitude. Nearby, Jacinto sleeps with one hand still loosely closed as though around a cup of coffee he finished hours ago, a habit none of his shipmates has ever managed to explain to him convincingly. Silas Turner, the green hand, sleeps deeply and without moving at all, the total sleep of a very young man who worked hard today and has not yet learned to let anxiety follow him into his hammock the way older sailors sometimes do. Amos Weeks alone remains awake past his watch, standing a few minutes longer near the wheel simply because the night is fine and he is in no particular hurry to trade it for sleep, a small private indulgence he allows himself perhaps once a week, on nights calm enough to make staying awake its own quiet reward. Even the ship's small, unofficial mascot, a lean grey cat named Barnacle, who came aboard as a kitten in New Bedford to keep the rat population down and has since made herself equally at home in the forecastle and the captain's own cabin, is asleep tonight, curled in the warmest corner of the galley near Freeman's banked coals, entirely unbothered by rank or hierarchy in a way that faintly amuses every man aboard who has noticed how easily she moves between a green hand's lap and the captain's own knee. Somewhere in the captain's cabin aft, the ship's official log holds its own version of today, considerably drier. Weather, course, sail carried. Nothing remarkable to report, a sentence that will read, to anyone who ever opens that log a century from now, as an entirely uneventful entry from an entirely uneventful day. It will never mention the dolphins. It will never mention Jacinto's card games or Amos Weeks' story about the whale off Gayhead or the shade of violet the sky wore this evening before the stars came out. That version of today belongs only to the men who actually lived through it, carried now in private logs and in memory and in nothing else, which is, when you think about it plainly, where most of any life's genuine texture ends up living anyway. Tomorrow is already written down, in its own way, before today has even fully finished. The watch bill posted near the scuttlebutt assigns Nathaniel's watch the same rotation it assigned today, larboard taking the deck at 4 in the morning, and the small, repeating architecture of the voyage will begin again almost before this night has finished ending. One day folding quietly into the next, the way it has folded, without real interruption, for 311 days already, and will keep folding for roughly 400 more. There is nothing waiting in tomorrow's watch bill to suggest tomorrow will differ meaningfully from today. And there is real comfort if a person allows themselves to feel it in exactly that sameness. Not every good day needs to be remarkable. Most of them, lived closely enough, are simply this: quiet and useful and warm enough in the ways that matter, folded gently into the one that came before it and the one that will come after. None of the 32 men aboard the Alcyon tonight knows exactly how their own individual story ends. Nathaniel does not yet know whether he will make boat steerer on this voyage or the next, whether the Scrimshaw Tooth will finish in time, whether Susanna's letters will keep arriving at the same steady if unpredictable pace, whether the pianoforte she is teaching herself will still be something she plays for him one day. In a parlour in Fairhaven, on an evening considerably quieter and considerably more permanent than this one. What he does know, tonight, asleep in a hammock swaying gently between two oak beams somewhere in the middle of the Pacific, is this rhythm, this creak of timber, this hush of water sliding past a hull that has carried him safely through 311 days and shows every sign, tonight, of carrying him through several hundred more. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whatever hour it happens to be where you have settled in, I hope this ship's slow rocking found its way into your own body somewhere along the way. The lanterns below are burning low now. The wheel is steady in a boat steerer's easy hands. The sea stretches out, calm and dark and entirely unremarkable in the very best sense of that word, in every direction the eye can reach. Sleep well, friend. We have spent an evening somewhere real, a long time ago, aboard a small wooden world that is, for tonight, exactly as quiet as it needs to be.